tells this story about how the SEAL teams were created. And it's basically a story of the SEALs against the world. The Navy doesn't want the SEALs, the Army doesn't want the SEALs, yet the SEAls go to Vietnam and they do these things that nobody else is going to do. They go into places that nobody else will go, and they establish a combat record that is unsurpassed. Now, a lot of that's true, but it's not fully true. One of the people that I first talked to when I was researching the history of the SEAL teams was Ron Young. I don't know if you recall, but you have what do you call the table over here?
Missing man table.
The missing man table, thank you. We have a missing man table over here for Ron Young. He was a huge supporter of Project Lifesaver. He was a former commanding officer of SEAL Team 6. And when I talked to Ron, he told me a story that was a little bit different. He said, we weren't always this good. It took some effort, to get the SEAL teams to become what the SEAL teams actually became, which got me curious. So I dove into the records. I was, for 10 years, I worked on this book, and I was going archive after archive, trying to find this story. And the story that I found was quite a bit different from this myth. See, it originates, the first SEALs were created to be these coastal raiders. That means they would take off from their rubber boats from the ship, they would paddle ashore, and they would find an enemy encampment or a commanding officer or a railroad or a train or something like that. They'd destroy it, and they'd go back to the water and they'd escape. Now, when the first SEALs got to Vietnam, they'd been preparing for that mission for 4.5 years. When they got there are no commanding officers, there's no commanding, there's no train depots, truck depots, there's no behind the lines targets to hit or coastal targets to hit. And they don't really know what to do. They've been preparing for this moment for 4.5 years. They've been waiting for it so much, they sent their top SEAL from SEAL Team 1. He handpicks the best SEAls, and they go to Vietnam, and none of the missions are there. They don't really know what to do. So that commanding officer, they do a couple of missions. They go out and they set some ambushes. They don't see any Viet Cong. They do some patrolling through enemy-infested territory. They don't encounter anybody. So eventually he says, you know what, this isn't the mission for us. We didn't train for this. So he confines his men to base, and he goes up to Saigon and he shacks up with a nurse. Pretty normal response, I would say. But his men, they're not really thrilled about that. And they go try and find their own nurses. Before long, they're in trouble, and the Navy leadership is ready to kick the SEALs out of Vietnam. This isn't what the Navy wanted. And everybody sort of blames everybody else. The Army blames the SEALs because, these Navy guys weren't meant to fight a land war. The Navy blames the Army. So what enemy? There's no enemy in this, little portion of the country that you put us in. The Navy, being the Navy, the Navy is the branch of service that will fire a commanding officer from a ship, even if his ship runs aground even while he's asleep. They blame the whole thing on leadership. They say, get rid of the leader, put a new leader in there, and the whole thing will fix itself. So that's what they did. Now, the guys that come in after, one second. The guys that come in after, they realize the war's not going to change. This is the only war in town. We're not going to let it go to waste. So they start experimenting. They try a bunch of different things. The patrol and ambush, that stuff doesn't work. So they create a little houseboat that they can live on. And they go out into these rivers, and they reduce the amount of time that they have to go back to base. They start setting more and more ambushes. Before long, they have some success. So much success that they start bringing other SEAL platoons in. But by that point, the war changes again. Now all those enemies that they've been successful in finding and killing and everything like that, they're not there anymore. So they have to adapt again. Actually, the platoon that adapts first to this new sort of style of warfare is the platoon that Ron Young was a part of. They actually adopt a sort of law enforcement strategy when it comes to fighting the Viet Cong. They have this idea, well, we're going to marry up with the police. The police know who the bad guys are. They'll tell us one person. We'll go find that person in this hooch. And once we get him, we'll interrogate him, and he's going to tell us where 5 more guys are. So they build this sort of cycle of operations that keeps them employed for the rest of the war. Nobody else really does this, at least in the Viet Cong Delta where the SEALs are. Now, there's probably a lot of things that we can talk about or highlight from that experience. I'm sure there's a leadership aspect that we could talk about. There's definitely a law enforcement angle that we could talk about, the strategic impacts of law enforcement, everything that you guys do, the sorts of operations that you guys undertake here, whether you realize it or not, it has outsized impacts around the world. But what I'd rather talk about is why the SEALs failed in the first place. See, what I think, when those first SEALs got to Vietnam and they looked at the battlefield, this was not the battlefield that they had prepared for. The operational circumstances had changed, and they were paralyzed by it. Now, I noticed this paralysis because I wasn't in the SEAL teams anymore. I'd actually left the SEAL teams, and I had joined the FBI. Now, when I was writing this book, I actually wrote my third chapter when I was at the FBI Academy. When I was writing chapter 6, when I got into my first shooting. I worked on this for, like I said, about 10 years. The whole time I was in this other institution. While I was in this other institution, I was noticing things about my institution that were different from the SEAL teams. And things that I noticed about my institution and the other institutions I was working with, various police departments and things like that, was how a simple change or a simple shift in the operational context could change how you responded to it. And it could easily paralyze an officer or a bunch of officers or an entire unit if they didn't know how to deal with it. Now, the military encounters these shifts in operational context all the time. Whether it's a new technology that gets introduced, and we're seeing something like that happen right now in Ukraine. This development, or this massive proliferation of drone technology, it's changing the battlefield. We're still not sure how to deal with that yet. That happens in law enforcement all the time. Whether it's social media, how social media has affected the drug market, the proliferation of 3D printers, on how guns are distributed in the inner cities, how those are changing guns, how that's changing the threat to law enforcement. I mean, how many times now are you in your current capacities outgunned by the criminals? Now, there are a few operational circumstances that I have seen that I think are really good showcases for us, and they should be looked at more. Does anybody recall or know what the date or the significance of April 20th, 1999 is? That's right. Absolutely. Columbine. Now, I'm not going to go through Columbine. I don't know who here actually had any touch points to that event, but I will call your attention to three numbers: 41, 69, 89. 41 minutes is how long it took for SWAT to get to the school. 69 minutes is how long it took for SWAT to actually make entry after they had arrived. 89 minutes is how long it took before they actually got to the crisis center. The shooters, Harris and Klebold, had been dead for over an hour before they even made entry. We know that it took at least 89 minutes for them to get to the crisis site because at one point, the students hung a sign out of the library window saying, "One bleeding to death." They did not get to that student before he died. Now, there was a lot talked about after that, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame thrown around to various officers. Now, the officers themselves, they tried to justify their slow response by saying, well, we didn't have intel, we didn't have good maps of the school, we didn't have enough ammunition, and it was very chaotic. There was a school alarm that was going off the entire time, and they couldn't communicate with each other. Now, anybody who's been in combat knows that those are the conditions you face whenever you are in combat. You don't have enough ammo, you don't have intel, and it's chaotic as hell. They were paralyzed by it. It was an operational circumstance that they had not imagined or anticipated. Now, the response to Columbine is a little chaotic. I think we would all agree. It doesn't lead immediately to reforms in how we respond to those types of incidents. In 2001, 2002, Texas State University starts the ALERT program, the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response training, which gets wide proliferation. And ultimately is picked up by the FBI as the standard for responding to these sorts of activities or emergencies. And for a number of years, we do have some success. It doesn't cut down on the number of active shooter incidents that we have, but it does give law enforcement a framework. The framework being, if you could boil alert training down to a single phrase, it would be stop the killing, stop the dying, which is a good model to go by. You're going to ignore all the wounded folks, and you're going to run to the crisis site, run to the sound of guns, eliminate the threat, and then you can address everything else. The most important thing is eliminating the target, or eliminating the threat. And it works, sort of. Then 23 years and 1 month later. We all know what happens then. The worst instance of operational paralysis in the history of this country, the Uvalde massacre. I'm not going to go through it. We've seen the videos. We know what happened. We know the toll that it took. We watched the officers in those hallways not really respond. The FBI's after-action report in the aftermath points the finger at a number of different things. Number one, doctrine. None of the officers there really responded the way they were supposed to respond. They didn't run to the sound of guns. It wasn't stop the killing, stop the dying. They got in there and then they stopped. Leadership. Leadership is a big factor. Chief Arredondo, he acted more like a corporal than he did a general. He spends precious minutes looking for a bullhorn so he can communicate through the walls, looking for keys. At first, he stops his officers from evacuating children out the windows because he wants to evacuate them out the doors for whatever reason, I don't know why. It takes 70 minutes before officers make entry. Now, I would suggest that there is a reason that the officers failed in that instance. More than doctrine, more than leadership, even more than training. Training was hit upon probably the most. Said the officers weren't trained for this. They hadn't, there were not enough officers on scene that had gone through the proper training. But of the 11 officers that showed up first, 9 of them had been through alert training within the last year. 10 of the 30 officers that were on scene, 10 of the 30 officers assigned to the Uvalde Police Department were SWAT qualified. They all had the long M4 guns that you see in the videos. They had as much firepower as the shooter. Even Chief Arredondo himself, over the previous 2 years, had taken 48 hours worth of alert training. That's 6 days worth of sitting in a classroom like this, getting instructed on how to respond to a situation like that. And yet he failed. I would suggest the reason that he failed is because it was a circumstance that he was not mentally prepared for. If that shooter had gone into that school and continued shooting, I think the officers would have responded much better than they actually did. What happened was the shooter went into the classroom and he stopped. So when the officers immediately went in, they weren't sure whether this was a barricade situation or if it was an active shooter situation. Well, barricade means that they don't have to respond immediately. It's awfully scary to have to run into a room with a guy pointing an M4 at you. So they chose to define the threat as this barricade or containment situation. And in fact, in the 70 minutes before they make entry, the words barricaded or contained are mentioned over the radio 26 times. That's the justification. Paralysis. I think paralysis is the culprit. Now, we've seen paralysis as a determining factor in other events, especially in the military. Now, if I hadn't been writing a book on military history, essentially, I wouldn't have noticed this. But I did. I was writing a book on military history. And in the course of writing that book on military history, I came in contact with a lot of different examples from various wars: World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And one example stuck out in particular that I think is worth us mentioning here. Now, when the German army and the Japanese army in World War II were on the offensive, they could not be beaten. They used all the elements that we would anticipate a modern, mechanized, thoughtful, tricky army to use. Nobody could defeat them. But when plans didn't go their way, the German army and the Japanese army, they didn't fold like a shirt, but they stiffened. They didn't know how to respond when things didn't go their way, when they lost the initiative, when they were suddenly confronted with a moment where they were paralyzed. The reason they couldn't adapt to a situation like that is because of their systems. They all came from a very hierarchical system, very bureaucratic. If they wanted to do something, they couldn't adapt to it without getting approval from their senior commanders. Now, if you look at the American side, American, British, they operated under this theory of decentralized command. I know it's a big fancy phrase, but all it really means is, well, we can't be in charge of you all the time, and you're going to have to use initiative in order to accomplish the mission. It's a system that works in a democratic society, where we understand that things aren't always going to go our way, and we have to be able to use initiative to succeed. Now, various units throughout the military are better than this at others. Army's pretty good at it, but the Army has never really been that far removed from its chain of command. Army officers, if they've ever had a question from their senior ranks, or they've had to get something approved, they've never really been more than one horseback ride away from their commander. Navy, on the other hand, Navy has to operate over the horizon, completely away from any semblance of authority. Which means that the Navy has to develop different systems of how to make decisions. The Navy is a much more initiative-based organization. And that's something that the SEAL teams have picked up. Now, in my research, I can confidently say now the SEAL teams are probably the best practitioners of decentralized command in the U.S. military. Which means that the SEAL teams are a valuable organization for all of us to want to understand. Why are they so successful at it? Why are they able to adapt? Why did those SEALs that replaced that first group of SEALs, why were they so quick to be able to shift to a threat that they hadn't trained for and planned for? I think it's a few different reasons. One, like I said, they came from an organization that allowed latitude to exist. Two, it was training. The SEAL teams were better trained than all of their Army competitors or peers. It's a funny thing that I came across in the book about how the SEAL teams, the Rangers had existed all through World War II, and they got rid of them. They kept Ranger School, but they eliminated the Rangers as a unit, but they kept the school. And it was funny. The Army's theory was, well, we're not going to have Rangers anymore. But what we'll have is we'll be able to send guys from the 101st Airborne, the 2nd Airborne, and the 1st Infantry Division. They'll all go to Ranger School, and then we'll come back, and they'll teach Ranger tactics to their comrades, and we'll have little Ranger pockets throughout the Army. It didn't really work like that. They went to the school, they forgot everything they learned, and they didn't pass any lessons on anywhere. So the tightest concentration of Ranger School graduates is actually in the Navy, it's in the SEAL teams. It's not what the Army intended. So the SEAL teams had more training, better training, more eclectic training than anybody else. But they also had something else. Now, remember how I talked about Tommy Norris in the beginning? Now, Tommy Norris was the guy who risked everything to go save those pilots, and how he had gotten his eye shot out on another mission. Well, after he had gotten his eye shot out, he wanted to continue serving his country, but everybody said, no, you don't have an eye. So he waited around for a couple of years, had something like 46 surgeries to fix his head, his eye, and everything like that. And finally, the FBI director said, hey, if you want to join the FBI, we'll gladly take you if you can pass all the tests. So he did. Joined the FBI and had a pretty storied career. He was one of the first volunteers to the hostage rescue team. And one of the first operations that the hostage rescue team did was in Puerto Rico. They were going after a Puerto Rican nationalist terrorist. And when they made entry, when the hostage rescue team made entry to go get this guy, the entire team is going up the stairs, and the terrorist, he leans over the balcony with a machine gun and sprays the whole team. A lot of guys get hit in the place, one guy gets shot in the face. The whole team backs up. Now, as they're out there, the team leader is looking around, he's trying to figure out a plan to go get this guy, and Tommy comes running from around the house. Now, remember, Tommy's only got one eye, and he comes up to the team leader and he goes, boss, I got an idea. all right, Tommy, what's the idea? He's like, how about I run upstairs and kill him? All right, Tommy, hang on. We'll put a pin in that. The reason I tell you that story is because a lot of organizations, they don't support ideas like that. I mean, I know that's a bad idea, but they don't have a culture where a subordinate can run up to a commander and suggest something as ludicrous as that. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. But more importantly, I think there's a couple of ways to make sure that you have an organization that can be adaptive. Now, all of the organizations that I have researched and studied that have been able to maintain their agility have been organizations that allow for ideas to come up from the bottom. The SEALs in Vietnam weren't successful because the planners suggested new tactics for them. The SEALs in Vietnam were successful because all of the tactics that they came up with, they came up organically. They came up ideas from all the guys on the ground. They were supported, but none of the ideas came up from up top. But they came up because the culture allowed them to come up. I think one of the reasons that the culture allows the SEAL teams to be as nimble, as agile as they are, is because they support that. I don't know the last time I called one of my senior officers by anything but his first name. I don't remember, in fact, the best leaders that I've ever had, whenever we've been on an operation or training or whatever, you always have a debrief after the fact. And the best leaders will always start that debrief by talking about what went wrong, what could be done better. And the best leaders will always start by saying what they did wrong. You say what you did wrong first, that allows for mistakes. Mistakes mean, well, if he made a mistake and he's in charge, well, that means I can make a mistake too. Doesn't mean I'm a bad guy or anything like that. But in other organizations, mistakes aren't tolerable. The hierarchy demands perfection. I think that's what's infecting law enforcement right now. We have a culture right now where the scrutiny is so high on all of us that we have allowed this pernicious impulse of perfection to overtake initiative. How can you say, stop the killing, stop the dying, if the people that are responsible for stopping the killing, stopping the dying, are more scared about being yelled at by the commander, or if they've never been able to use their initiative before? That's about all I got. I'm delighted to be here. I didn't know what this organization was before I got here, but I will say that from my own family's perspective, and knowing what the mission is now, I couldn't be prouder to support this. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Sure.
Hi, Ron Jr. Ben, first, thank you for your service. I know how excited my dad was to work with you. He described you as the premier naval special warfare historian in the world. So the interviews you guys had together, towards the end of his life there were very special, so thank you for that. My question for you is this. You talk about trying to be successful inside organizations that may or may not have a culture that allows for the bubbling up of ideas. One of the through lines that we've seen at this conference and perennially is trying to get ideas and concepts like Project Lifesaver, like the bracelets, like understanding autism itself, to surface such that it gets senior leader initiative. And you talk about the generational gaps where, well, they didn't have autism when I was coming up the ranks. What is this now? So what advice will you have to try and be successful in introducing and taking the initiative on things like Project Lifesaver and the understanding, interacting with the autistic community to senior leadership such that the program can move forward?
That's a good question. Success is contagious, and so is a good story. I think you have both here, based on what limited conversations I've had. The challenge is, how do you get that story out there in an age where our attention span is so curtailed. But the one thing that I've noticed in the writing of the book, in looking at various units that had sort of an uphill climb to relevancy, is they haven't, initiative alone won't do it, latitude, from above won't do it. They have to survive through partnerships. Partnerships are the coin of the realm, if you will, for survival for an organization that doesn't have a natural customer. Maritime Special Operations units are always going to be at a disadvantage from land-based Special Operations units. Land-based Special Operations units, they don't have to justify their existence. Rangers never have to say, what's our mission? SEALs always have to say, what's our mission, because, they're the naval commandos. And naval commandos have no business raiding a mountaintop in Afghanistan more than 600 miles from the closest saltwater. This organization, you just have to be awfully efficient with the story that you tell. We had a conversation about an hour and a half ago, where you told me how many children with autism go missing every year, the problem with that they face when they go missing because of the attraction they have with the water, and how successful Project Lifesaver has been in recovering those children. That's enough. That's a boilerplate. Now, how do you get the message out there? Fortunately, there are outlets that just didn't exist 10 years ago. There's social media. Find a 15-year-old who knows how to make an Instagram reel. You've got something. But partnerships and message, and it's a compelling story. So I'm only learning about it today.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I'll wait for the mic.
Sure.
Thank you. By the way, 5 years ago when I'm ambassador for this organization, because I'm an actor, and I had a couple of years or more in a soap opera playing an Alzheimer's arc. And I also was in a cop show years before that, so somehow that got me on each other's radar screen. And see, something you alluded to that David Briggs this morning in his presentation, you touched on, I think, beautifully, that we are in this place. We have this big zero-sum game coming up of an election. There's going to be a winner and a loser. This is what we've done. This is part of what you're talking about, and yet we have this concern, that some people on whatever side, whoever confrontations, that we're in a room of thought leaders, because they wouldn't be here if they weren't, in a world that will have to deal with that somehow, even with their own political understandings or positions or perspectives, and I would wonder what you would have to say in that, because that seems to be an opportunity for all kinds of paralysis. And I'd just love you to share a little more about that.
Paralysis in the future. Boy. As far as various law enforcement units that are going to be facing the challenges going ahead, is that what you're asking?
Yes. If I could have put it in those
Boy, that is
two words.
That's a good question. I mean, the operational circumstances for law enforcement, I think, are more challenging than they are for the military. The military deals with essentially two main factors, or two main drivers of transformation. One is technology. You've got rifles give way to machine guns, machine guns give way to tanks, tanks give way to blitzkrieg. I mean, there's sort of a progression in how the military evolves its technologies to kill people. Then you also have the organizational transformation that the military goes through with you don't have technology to get around a various problem. They come up with different systems that come up with it. Law enforcement has this not just a technological challenge on the streets or wherever that they're dealing with. They're also dealing with the social change. You see what cell phone cameras have done to policing, maybe for better or for worse, I'm not sure, probably for better. Now certain tactics that were available to law enforcement are not available, but law enforcement has adapted to take advantage of that technology. So now law enforcement who used to be afraid of being recorded are taking advantage. Now every law enforcement officer has a body camera, so their actions can defend them. I don't know how the next or the political fallout is going to change the operational landscape for law enforcement. I do know, I suspect, just based on being a historian and seeing what's happened in the past, I suspect there will be some latency in how law enforcement adapts. It's going to be a period of paralysis. Chicago went through, when the defund the police movement was going on in Chicago, we had a banner year when it came to homicides. Almost 1,000 homicides in Chicago, based off of, not just the riots, but also various legal challenges that were going through the courts. You had a system where many of the judges, it was sort of a catch and release program in Chicago at the time. And we're not in that situation right now. Homicides are down in Chicago, but it's not going to be great for a bit. It's going to take some creative, thoughtful people to figure out how to deal with the next set of challenges, whether they're technological, social, or legal. I'll be curious to see how they do it. Anyone else? All right, thank you so much. It's been a delight to be here.